Hello and welcome. This is Wilrens for Create a Learning Site, the place to go deeper in your understanding of the Bible. As teachers, we often focus on a limited number of books that we teach often and leave others unexplored. In my case, neglected books include Samuel and James. I'm not sure I ever taught James, and if I did, it was probably only once or twice. I appear to be in good company, or at least I'm not alone. Quote, "The letter of James is among the most neglected books of the New Testament canon." Well, that cannot be right, so here we go. One reason for the lack of popularity may be the perceived sharpness of James. You have to wonder about an author who starts off, after the briefest of introductions, with "Count it all joy, my brothers, when you meet trials of various kinds." Who wants to hear that? Makes you feel like the dandelion on the picture. James is obviously not out to please his readers. However, James' message encompasses both sternness and grace. For instance, he reminds us that mercy triumphs over judgment. It's a phrase unique to James. And he addresses his audience several times as "my beloved brothers." Another reason for its neglect might be our preference for theoretical teachings over practical application. David Dockery calls James the most practical book in the New Testament. Emphasizing the importance of action challenges our tendency to remain passive. Additionally, James appears to contradict Paul, and if we must choose between justified by faith, not by works, so Paul, or justified by works and not by faith, so literally James 2 verse 24, we'd rather side with Paul. However, although my quotation was technically correct, it's entirely misleading. This is not what James says. I left out the final word, alone. James does not deny that we are justified by faith. He claims we are not justified by faith alone. So according to James, we are indeed justified by faith. But this idea can be abused. James argues against the notion of faith as mere assent that something is true. As James points out, even demons have this kind of faith. No doubt, Paul would agree that true faith should be accompanied by righteous actions. More on this later. One more challenge in studying James is discerning its main point and overall coherence. Is it merely a collection of practical advice? Or is there an underlying thread that unifies the various topics addressed? What is it about? That's a tough question. I'm still working on it and it will be the subject of a follow-up issue. But I did ask ChatGPT, my very first use of it, and here's what I got. Question: how would you summarize the content of the Epistle of James in the Bible in 3 sentences? Answer: the Epistle of James in the Bible emphasizes the importance of living out one's faith through action. It encourages believers to be doers of the word, not just hearers, and addresses various practical issues such as favoritism, controlling the tongue, and caring for the poor. James emphasizes the need for genuine faith that is demonstrated by good works and seeks to guide Christians in living a righteous and fruitful life. Follow-up question: choose one sentence from the Epistle of James itself that best expresses its message and main idea. And the answer: 2 verse 26, "Faith without works is dead." Pretty good, I would say. But the first answer illustrates the very real problem with James. The epistle addresses, quote, "various practical issues." Yes, indeed. But does that mean the letter is like a bag of loose sand, or does something hold these various issues together? And if so, why would it be James 2 verse 26? More on this next time. By the way, I prefer James 1 verse 22 as the key statement of its message. But be doers of the word and not hearers only. The two verses are close in content, but James is not out to help us understand something. he wants us to act. Therefore, the imperative of 1 verse 22 is more to the point. But either way, it's not immediately obvious why this would be the unifying idea or aim of James. Again, more on this next time. To understand James more fully, we must consider its genre. I will also briefly discuss the sources that have influenced him. I will look at two obvious difficulties in the book, and I will finish with a word on authorship. First, genre. What is James? It initially presents itself to us as a letter, but this only holds true in the first verse. It really tells us how the message was delivered, but not what it is. Many have sought to explain James in terms of wisdom literature and the wisdom tradition in Israel. Richard Bockham, for instance, eloquently argues this case in his book Wisdom of James, Disciple of Jesus, the Sage. The ESV, in its introduction to James, states that it is sometimes called the Proverbs of the New Testament. However, James shows more coherence than Proverbs, and although James is certainly indebted to the wisdom tradition in Israel, is hardly less indebted to the law, the prophets, and even the historical books. And James is not simply dispelling nuggets of practical wisdom, instructing his readers on how to live wisely and righteously. He acts more like a prophet, confronting and correcting his audience. What also stands out is the conversational tone of James. Repeatedly he addresses his audience directly with "my brothers." Therefore, as so often in the New Testament, we are dealing with an oral text. The many imperatives show that we are dealing with a word of exhortation. In other words, it's a sermon, or in more scholarly terms, a homily. Thus argues Ben Witherington, and I think he's right. We are reading an ancient sermon in which James applies many of the conventions and principles of ancient rhetoric, much like Paul does in his letters. Nevertheless, despite his use of ancient rhetoric, James has been heavily influenced by the Old Testament, especially wisdom literature, but also the law. The allusions and parallels are numerous. There is a second source that greatly shapes the Epistle of James: the teachings of Jesus. Douglas Moo asserts no New Testament document is more influenced by the teaching of Jesus than James. In fact, the teachings of James are seen in virtually every section and theme of James. One scholar points out that there have been claimed 175 different allusions by many scholars since the beginning of critical scholarship between James and Jesus. Perhaps not surprisingly, seeing that Matthew is a Jewish gospel, especially Matthew and the Sermon on the Mount make a frequent appearance in James. It's an interesting and worthwhile exercise to hunt for echoes of and references to various sayings of Jesus. They are plentiful. Next, two obvious difficulties in James. I touched on the first one under reasons for neglect, point 3. Does James contradict Paul? I already pointed out that James does not claim that justification is by works, nor does he claim that justification is not by faith. He argues that justification is not by faith alone, but needs to be completed by works. I'm convinced that Paul, on reading this, would not have objected. And James does not disagree with what Paul wrote. They are essentially in agreement. James knew the gospel that Paul preached and had approved it, according to Galatians 2 and again in Acts 15. Does James then seek to correct a distortion of Paul's teaching, an abuse of justification by faith alone as an excuse to do nothing? Perhaps, but it's far from certain. Such abuse may well have arisen quite independently of anything Paul preached or wrote. James is not obviously interacting with Paul or his teaching. His aim is passive faith rather than a particular doctrine. It's worth pointing out that the works James is thinking of are not circumcision, Sabbath and the like, but rather practical acts of love. Faith without such works is dead. Paul, I think, would have agreed and would have rejected the distortion of passive faith as fervently as James does. See Romans 6. And by the way, so do Martin Luther and John Calvin, arguably the strongest proponents of justification by faith in church history. Quote, "Faith alone saves, but the faith that saves is not alone." Often quoted, these words are ascribed to both Luther and Calvin. It was actually Calvin rather than Luther who said it, at least in these exact words, but Luther was in essential agreement. Idle faith is not justifying faith. We say that justification is effective without works, not that faith is without works. And one more time, Luther, faith is a living, restless thing. It cannot be inoperative. We are not saved by works, but if there be no works, there must be something amiss with faith. We also need to keep in mind that Paul and James wrote for different audiences and responded to different problems. Paul is out to defend freedom from the law for Gentile converts. They do not have to become Jews. James is writing for a Jewish audience. His readers are followers of Jesus, but they are also Jews. They need to understand how Jesus is the fulfillment of the law. Or in the words of Christopher Morgan, Paul was preaching the gospel to Gentiles and declaring that they could be saved apart from the Jewish works of the law. James was preaching the gospel to Jews and needed to show how Christianity is consistent with, the extension of, and the climax of the law and its teachings. These contextual differences are quite significant to our interpretation of Paul and James. James had the monumental task of showing how Christianity is the extension and the fulfillment of Judaism, and how this was articulated by the prophets of old. So, Morgan. Let's keep this in mind as we address the next question. What is the law of liberty? The second difficulty in James is understanding of the law. James is a Jewish Christian writing to Jewish Christians or Jewish followers of Jesus. What is his understanding of the law? And what does he mean by the law of liberty? One possibility is that James upholds the Torah more or less as before the coming of Christ. In that case, what has changed is believers. The same law now functions differently since they have been transformed. Now, James 2, verse 8 through 12, indeed appears to support the continuing validity of the Old Testament law. However, it should be noticed that the law in that passage is applied to transgressors. Breaking the law leads to condemnation. Keeping the law is not said to result in salvation or justification. Again, Paul would not find fault with what James writes in this paragraph. See 1 Timothy chapter 1, where Paul expresses a very similar idea. The law is for transgressors. It should also be pointed out that James qualifies the term law. James speaks of the perfect law, the law of liberty twice, and of the royal law. This would hardly be necessary if he simply meant to refer to Torah. James appears to make a distinction. The easiest to understand is the term royal law. Very much in the line of Jesus, James quotes the commandment to love our neighbor, the second greatest command in the law. Again, James and Paul are not far apart on this. See Romans chapter 13, verse 8 and following. Love is the fulfillment of the law. As for the other two phrases, based on James 1, verse 21 to 25, they are synonyms of the word. And this word is the word which quote, is able to save your souls. James 1, verse 21. In other words, this word is the gospel, and therefore the law of liberty is much more than Torah. To be sure, the law of liberty is rooted in the Old Testament law, and it substantially overlaps with it, but it also transcends it. It is much broader and incorporates the words and teachings of Jesus and even Jesus himself. The law of liberty is a glorious thing, the life-giving Word of God. It has nothing in common with the legalism of the Judaizers or the circumcision party that we know from Galatians. Finally, a brief word on authorship. There is some debate about it, but in my opinion, the case for James, the brother of Jesus, mentioned in Matthew and Mark, is very strong. According to Acts and early church history, this James became an important leader in the Church of Jerusalem. Now, if the author is indeed the biological brother of Jesus and the leader of the Jerusalem church known from the book of Acts, one of those Paul referred to as pillars in Galatians, we would do well to pay close attention to what he has to say.
The show will be starting in just a few moments. Thank you for your patience. The show will be starting in just a few moments.